I'm Alastair Lack, and I'm a student or graduate of Oxford University. And what I want to do is to take you on a tour of central Oxford, and in particular to talk about the many international links that this great university has throughout the world. I'm standing outside the University Church of St Mary the Virgin, which is really where the university first began over 800 years ago. Oxford as a city is pretty well in the middle of England. Situated on the River Thames, of course it's called the Isis here in Oxford, it has possibly the finest collection of medieval buildings in England. You could say it's quintessential England, but I think that forgets the point that for many, many centuries, some centuries more than others, Oxford University as an academic institution has always looked out and has always attracted scholars and students from all over the world. I suppose the very first European student who came to Oxford was Emo, or Emo, of Friesland. Friesland now is in the north of the Netherlands. He came to Oxford in 1190, and he was of noble birth. He was a fine scholar, and obviously a very determined man to come all the way to Oxford to pursue his studies. Some 300 years later, as the European Renaissance burst into England, burst into Oxford, another great scholar came to Oxford, Erasmus, the Dutch scholar, in 1499. Now, he spent 3 months at St Mary's College, and he enjoyed himself very much. Here, writing in Latin, he describes one particular Oxford occasion. He goes to a college feast, and he writes, in Latin of course, "Nothing was wanting. The good cheer would have satisfied Epicurus. The table talk would have pleased Pythagoras. The guests might have peopled a Greek academy, not merely made up a dinner party." And today, some 17.5% of undergraduates come from outside the United Kingdom, and a third of all students. Americans have over 1,700 students this academic year studying at Oxford, China over 1,200, and Germany over 700. Students, in fact, come from Afghanistan and Albania to Zambia and Zimbabwe. And of course, academic staff are equally diverse. And since I began with 2 European figures, Emo and Erasmus, let's look at one or two of the links between Oxford and mainland Europe. Why not take France first? Because in 1167, the English king, Henry II, forbade English students from studying at the University of Paris. So they came to Oxford and augmented the figures. The Maison Française in North Oxford still continues to thrive and study all matters to do with French culture. The Ashmolean has the finest and largest collection of Pissarro paintings in the world. In fact, I was looking at one yesterday in the Ashmolean. And of course, the Bodleian Library, the great Bodleian, has the oldest manuscript of the great French saga La Chanson de Roland. Nor must we forget the Voltaire Institute, again in North Oxford, which is a byword for particularly 18th century scholarship. And we shouldn't forget there are over 200 French students here this academic year. But those numbers actually are rather dwarfed by Germany. Germany has 700 students. And of course, we also have the link between Oxford and 4 Berlin universities. And I think Oxford should be rightly proud of its role in helping to educate Germans of very different backgrounds. For example, Adam von Trott before the Second World War, Ernst Schumacher, the great economist, and Richard von Weizsäcker, the president of West Germany and the first president of a united Germany. And of course, many other countries in Europe send students to Oxford. We have close to 300 students from Italy, close to 150 from Spain. Oxford, incidentally, has the only department of Portuguese studies of any British university, and indeed students come from A to, I want to say Z, but A to U, from Austria and Albania through to Ukraine and Uzbekistan. Not forgetting, of course, Scandinavia, Russia, Romania, and many other European countries. Well, behind me is one of my favourite buildings in Oxford. It's now called the Oxford Martin School, but I think a lot of people will remember it with affection as the Indian Institute. It was built at the end of the 19th century, and it really was a home for civil servants, Indian civil servants and British civil servants who worked for the British Raj. It's covered with heads of elephants and tigers, demigods of the Hindu caste, and a lovely, lovely weather vane of a gold elephant. A chair in Sanskrit was established in 1832. The first Indian students arrived in 1871, and the Oxford University Press established itself in India in 1912. Well, today over 300 Indian students are studying at Oxford, and the India-Oxford initiative links the university here with many Indian institutions, whilst the Ashmolean, of course, extends in terms of Indian paintings and artifacts from the early days of the flowering of the Indus Valley civilization to the paintings of the late Mughal Empire in the 19th century. The Pitt Rivers Museum, for example, has the world's largest collection of Naga artifacts from Assam, and other collaborations between Oxford and India include the Intergrowth 21st, Young Lives, and a cultural heritage program of digitising 200,000 images of Indian art and architecture. Well, now, Indian Oxford alumni are many and varied, and many of them very eminent indeed. Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner for economics, Indira Gandhi, of course, Mansur Ali Khan, the Nawab Pataudi, he was the Indian cricket captain, and Manmohan Singh, the 14th Prime Minister of India. Now, having talked about India, we mustn't forget the other countries and their links with Oxford of the subcontinent. You have, of course, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal, where the Oxford Clinical Research Unit does much good work in Nepal. And for example, let's take Pakistan. We have about 80 plus students here and many notable alumni. Let's just take, of course, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and his daughter Benazir Bhutto, Liaquat Ali Khan, the first Prime Minister of Pakistan, and currently, of course, that great cricketer and now turned politician, Imran Khan. Well, Rhodes House behind me must be one of the most instantly recognisable buildings in Oxford. It was built in the early part of the 20th century by Sir Herbert Baker, and it really was a memorial to Cecil Rhodes. It was also a centre for learning and teaching and the administrative headquarters of the Rhodes Scholarships. Now, of course, at the moment, Cecil Rhodes is quite an interesting figure, not to say controversial, but I want to concentrate on the scholarships. They began in 1903 and were for students from the British Empire, the then British Empire, and the United States. And a year or two later, students from Germany arrived as well. But today it's much more wide in terms of the countries that award scholarships, and over 100 every year students come to Oxford as Rhodes Scholars. Nevertheless, there are still very strong links with the United States. They were, of course, the original participants. And today, the greatest number of students from outside the United Kingdom come from the United States. And ditto, the greatest amount of academics who don't come from UK come from the United States. The OUP, the Oxford University Press, has very long links with the United States. For example, Barack Obama was sworn in as president on the Bible printed by the Oxford University Press. And it was the same Bible that Abraham Lincoln had been sworn in. The roll call of Americans educated at Oxford is long and impressive. First, a tranche of English people who went to America, like Richard Bellingham, governor of Massachusetts, Lawrence Washington, his son went to Virginia, and a descendant became George Washington, first president. More recently, of course, Bill Clinton, a Rhodes Scholar at University College, and Dean Rusk, perhaps not particularly well known these days, but he was Secretary of State to President Kennedy and Johnson. He was at St. John's College. In fact, the New Frontier government of President Kennedy, the Washington joke was, how do you get into the government? Answer, go to Oxford and turn left. Now let's take Canada, with almost 400 students, and again, an impressive list of alumni. People like Lester Pearson and John Turner, premiers, Robert Bourassa of Quebec, and Mark Carney, the recent governor of the Bank of England here in the United Kingdom. Moving further south, the Latin America Centre, based at St. Anthony's, founded in 1965, looks at all matters to do with Latin America. In Chile, Oxford has links with the government and indeed has an observatory near Santiago. Oxford's had long links in medical research in Mexico, and of course in Brazil, well, not so much in Brazil. Here in Oxford, there's an annual Brazilian carnival showing the vibrancy of Brazilian culture. Nor should we forget some of these smaller Caribbean islands. People like Norman Manley and Eric Williams have studied at Oxford and gone back to become prime ministers or premiers in their own country. Now, Malala Yousafzai, you may remember, was at the age of 15 when she survived an assassination attempt in Pakistan. She inspired a right to education bill, spoke at the United Nations, opened a school in Lebanon, and won the Nobel Peace Prize. But in fact, this last summer, she just finished her degree at Lady Margaret Hall in PPE. And she's just one of a very long roll call of incredibly successful Oxford students, women students, who've gone on to great things after the university. I'll just mention one or two. I could mention many others. Benazir Bhutto, Aung San, of course, the Myanmar leader. Ingrid Betancourt, who was imprisoned for 6.5 years by the FARC rebels in Colombia. Susan Rice, who was Barack Obama's ambassador to the United Nations and indeed National Security Advisor, and Amal Clooney from St. Hughes. She read jurisprudence and married George Clooney, whoever he is. As well as Rhodes scholarships, of course, there are many other scholarships that can be won. Let me just choose one very influential. The Clarendon Fund provides fully funded scholarships for over 400 students in all disciplines, and Oxford University Press provides the core funding. Now, it is an ancient institution here in Oxford, goes back to the 1400s, but in terms of overseas offices, it started quite early. In 1896, the first office was opened in New York, and in the decade before the First World War, offices opened in Paris, Nairobi, Ibadan, and Canada. So it is really the largest and most successful university press in the world, and Oxford Journals publishes more than 700 scholarly journals, all online, and millions of people around the world either get taught one-on-one or through online services provided by OUP. And finally, it publishes in almost 100 languages, including some of the most vulnerable and fast declining. Just to mention one Asian country, Japan, OUP opened an office in Tokyo as long ago as 1957. Japanese has been taught at Oxford for over 100 years. It also boasts the Nissen Centre Library at St. Anthony's. And it hosts with the Blavatnik School of Government the annual Kyoto Prize for the betterment of humankind. It's just one of those prizes situated in Oxford that enriches the Oxford academic year. Nor must we forget Australia and New Zealand, who've been sending students to Oxford for many years. There have been premiers, there have been people like Rupert Murdoch, the financial and publishing magnate, Lord Florey, who won a Nobel Prize, and the President of Fiji, Ratu Sekamisesi Mara. And finally, we mustn't forget that Oxford is very much part of the International Alliance of Research Universities. 11 leading universities all over the world, including Tokyo University, Yale, Beijing University, National University of Singapore, and indeed the Australian National University. Well, as I'm sure you know, I'm standing in front of the Ashmolean, named after Elias Ashmore, and it opened in Broad Street, round the corner in 1683. We're now in Beaumont Street, and it was really the world's first university museum. And if Oxford is international, so is the Ashmolean. A mantle of deerskins and shells known as Poetes mantle is still preserved in the museum, joined by a wonderful collection of paintings and drawings by Raphael, Michelangelo and other great masters, Greco-Roman archaeological items and much else. Some idea of the international scope of the museum may be found in the index to the plans of the galleries. Let's take the letter C, for example. Ceramics, Asian, Chinese art, Claude Lorraine, the French painter, clocks and watches, Cretan antiquities, and let's take M. We have Majolica, Meissen porcelain, metalwork, Japanese, Minoan antiquities, mummies, and musical instruments. And of course, the Natural History Museum and the Pitt Rivers Museum are equally diverse in artefacts. Whether it's the Natural History Museum's extinct replicas of the Jurassic Seas, the Pitt Rivers' wealth of ethnography and manuscripts collections. There's an axe from Papua New Guinea, masks from Mexico, and the wonderful Arabian photos by the traveller Wilfrid Festiger. The History of Science Museum in the Broad Street has many wonderful astronomical instruments from the Islamic world as well as China. And so throughout Oxford there are many links to China. Through students, remember over 1200, the presence of the Oxford China Centre, Europe's largest university centre, and the Bodleian Library acquired its first Chinese manuscript in 1604. Oxford welcomed its first Chinese visitor a long time ago, 1684, a first professorship in the late 19th century, and you could gain a BA in Chinese Studies in 1939. Now, switching from museums to another sphere, the university has produced over 50 Nobel laureates, and some of the great names of literature, economics and science who came from outside Oxford to study or teach here. Lord Florey, I mentioned earlier, an Australian, gained the prize for his work in the development of penicillin alongside Sir Ernest Chain, German-born and Fellow of University College. Lester Pearson, Prime Minister of Canada, won the Peace Prize, as did Aung San Suu Kyi more recently. V.S. Naipaul, the writer, won the Literature Prize, and Nicholas Tinbergen, who came from the Netherlands, won the Nobel Prize for Medicine for his work in animal behaviour. More recently, academics, Sir Paul Nurse, a geneticist, Sir John Gurdon, and Sir John Gurdon, an economist, all part of International Oxford. And incidentally, Sir John Bell from Canada is currently Regius Professor of Medicine. He's an immunologist and is at the forefront of Oxford University's efforts to find a vaccine for COVID-19. But it's not all just academics educated here. Monarchs, princes have also come to Oxford. King Abdullah of Jordan, Emperor Naruhito of Japan and Empress Masaka, Sultan Nazreen Shah of Perak in Malaysia, Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia, the King of Bhutan. But I want to talk a little bit about a rather controversial, perhaps even romantic figure. Felix Yusupov came from one of the wealthiest families in Russia, and his arrival in Oxford was unexpected. The reason seemed to be the family were worried about his wild ways in St. Petersburg. He lived well in Oxford, kept a bear cub in his rooms, and I don't think did very much work. He stayed till 1912 at University College, played a full part in college, but then wrote to the college asking in 1912 to be taken off the college's books, as he was so busy in Russia. And a few years later, he gained a certain immortality as one of the conspirators to kill Rasputin. I'm on the steps of the Clarendon building in Broad Street, which I'm sure many people will remember. Of course, I can't manage to mention every country and every continent of the world, but I just want to focus for a moment on Africa, because African studies have been a part of the Oxford set up for several centuries. And we have the African Studies Centre, the International Growth Centre, and the Kemmery Wellcome Trust programme. And now that works across Kenya, Uganda, and the region, focusing in particular on problems of ageing and mortality. Two others are the International Migration Institute and the Young Lives Project, which focuses particularly on Africa. Scholarships, of course, for African students are available, and currently students come from over 30 African countries. The greatest number, some 136, from South Africa, with its long links to Oxford through the Rhodes Scholarships, the Oppenheimer Fund, and such collaborations as the Oxford Human Rights Hub Network. And of course the university and indeed the colleges have benefited from great benefactors. Of course many of them English, like Cecil Rhodes and Dr. John Radcliffe, but many benefactors coming from outside the United Kingdom. Let me just point out one or two. Cecil and Ida Green of Texas Instruments, instrumental in the foundation of Green College. A gentleman I find very interesting, Antonin Bess, who began life as a young shipping clerk, became an entrepreneur in the Levant, and really was the founder of St. Anthony's College in North Oxford. Leonard Blavatnik endowed the Blavatnik School of Government, Rafiq Said, the Said School of Business, and just recently the American Stephen Schwarzman has given £150 million to fund the Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities, and of course there have been many others. Well, if any Oxonian thinks of a single building that perhaps represents learning in Oxford University, I wonder if it would be the Bodleian Library behind me. It has treasures literally from all over the world. And I just want to, rather than go through all the treasures, pay attention to a wonderful series of postcards that I have at home. Each image is chosen to represent a letter of the alphabet. So, for example, B is for Boccaccio and one of his romances. C is for the Codex Lord, a manuscript from pre-conquest Mexico. J is for Japan and a picture scroll from the 16th century cultural period there. L for the Life of Buddha. It's an 18th century Thai folding book in Pali with miniature paintings. And just two more. N is for a book of Flemish Ars called the Nassau Ars, and P is for Pliny's wonderfully richly illuminated natural history. And that's not even to mention the First Folio of Shakespeare, the several Magna Carta engrossments, and one of the great picture books of the Middle Ages, Marco Polo's Travels. Well, to state the obvious, Oxford is a place of learning. And I want to finish with just a few of the international collaborations of the university through the 4 academic divisions of Oxford. In the humanities, in particular, I must mention Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in Humanities. It sponsors major research programs such as environmental humanities, race and resistance, digital humanities. The mathematical, physical and life sciences play a role in projects as diverse as the Rosalind Franklin Institute the Faraday Institute, and of course the UK and European Space Agency. Medical science, with its long-standing network of clinical research units in Asia and Africa, and of course at present the university is at the forefront of efforts to combat the COVID-19 challenge. And finally, the social sciences division. It engages and collaborates with other universities, government and non-governmental institutions, and it has practice in the fields of law, business, public health and education. Unless that's all a little too abstract, can I just give a few illustrations? And I'm afraid I have to admit many, many more. Oxford, as I said earlier, has the only Portuguese department in the United Kingdom. Digital Panopticon brings together records from Australia and United Kingdom convicts sentenced in London between 1780 and 1825. The Wetherill Institute of Molecular Medicine, in particular, is looking at treatment against infections and disease. And I mentioned earlier the Kemmery Wellcome Trust doing research across Kenya, Uganda and that part of Africa. The Young Lives Project of the Department of International Development, Queen Elizabeth House, Africa Research on Aging, Southeast Asian Studies Group and the Oxford China Centre, as I said, Europe's largest such centre. So there are just a few of the examples of international collaboration where UK students and above all international students are taking part. So what happens to all these international students when they leave Oxford? Well, most of them of course go on to very interesting careers, but perhaps I ought to mention the Oxford University Alumni Society. It has branches all over the world, some 150 in over 90 countries, that allow Oxford students to keep in touch not only with each other, but, so to speak, with their alma mater. I want to finally end with the words of an American student at Oxford who wrote, "The common denominator that I find at Oxford is the ability to think deeply, whether it's a newspaper article, a piece of research or an object, and it's the ability to refuse absolutely to take things at face value." And in the long history of the university, the international dimension of Oxford, so important, has been vital to thinking deeply and to refuse to take things at face value. So I say, long may the international links flourish.